My name is Kira Ashford, and on a night that should have been harmless, my own family turned me into the after-dinner joke. At our table, with the silverware still chiming against porcelain, my father, Martin Hale, lifted his glass and called me a freeloader. There was no wink to soften it, no laugh to frame it as teasing, only all those quiet years poured into a single public verdict. Less than one day later, in a room of glass and executives, a person he was desperate to impress would meet my eyes and say, very simply, "Good morning, ma'am." I have lived with that split screen for a long time, invisible where I was born and impossible to ignore everywhere else, and I have learned how easily a family legend can erase the facts that refuse to flatter it. The house remembered me even if the people inside preferred not to. The porch light did its old stutter, blinking a heartbeat late as if uncertain whether to welcome me or warn me away. Early autumn put a clean edge on the air. Every small sound traveled farther than it should. My heels cracked across the gravel and I took one slow breath before opening the door. Inside, time had been preserved under glass. The scent was still lemon and old polish. The third floorboard in the hall still complained when you stepped on it, the same plank I used to hop for luck. Along the wall, frames marched in ruler-straight lines, baby cheeks and graduation caps, lake trips and ribbon cuttings. Brandon Hale in a suit, Brandon shaking hands, Brandon presenting a chart. Not a single photograph showed me in uniform, not even the default graduation print. It looked as if someone had practiced cropping me out of pictures and then kept right on cropping until memory obeyed. In the living room, Martin paced with a phone to his ear, glancing at his watch as if he could schedule respect. Brandon camped by the mantel with a wine glass and a borrowed monologue about leadership theories. Every sentence wore podcast shine. From the kitchen, my mother Claudia drifted in with a smile she keeps for neighbors and minor emergencies. "Well, look who finally showed," she said, more time-stamped than greeting. There was no hug, there was a slideshow. "Go on in, we're celebrating your brother. He made senior project lead last quarter. Impressive, right?" I matched her politeness because it cost less than contradiction and stepped into a dining room dressed like a small gala. Candles breathed inside glass sleeves, place cards sat at attention. A pocket-sized podium waited for speeches about grit and merit. My name, of course, was on no card. I chose the last chair near the kitchen door, half hidden by a service card, the perfect view for a person allowed to witness but not to belong. Dinner launched like a commercial. Every anecdote orbited Brandon. His initiative, his wins, his effortless charm. Laughter rose and fell on his timing. Claudia leaned close, perfume edging out the lemon. "Sorry, we forgot the invite," she whispered. "We assumed you were too busy." 1 week earlier, I had texted that I would fly in. She had replied with a floating thumbs up, the emoji equivalent of a shrug. Martin tapped his glass. "To Brandon," he announced, chin raised in that managerial humility, "for rising by merit, not shortcuts." Applause arrived on schedule. And then he added it, light as a garnish. "Some people take initiative, others coast and freeload. That only works until people wise up." He did not say my name. He did not need to. The room tightened. Forks hovered. Somewhere, someone laughed into a napkin. Brandon chuckled, pleased to be the son. I felt my spine align and kept my face still. I had seen this episode before. It was the same household where my acceptance into a research corps had once been labeled the scholarship mistake, where I was told I could have been a lawyer or gone to Bexley and Company or done something grounded. They preferred a climb they understood to a service they did not. After dessert, I left the table with the quiet efficiency of a ghost and stepped into the hallway. The house exhaled to its old hum. I opened the secure work portal on my phone and scrolled tomorrow's agenda. Defense Contract Review, Military-Civilian Integration. There it was, in unembellished bold, Principal Advisor, Cybersecurity Division, Bureau of National Security. My name had always belonged where outcomes were measured, not where toasts were rehearsed. I held the screen beside a framed family photo, the kind where my face used to live, and watched my reflection float over the glass. "We will see who freeloads whom tomorrow," I said aloud, not angry, not dramatic, just certain. Then I slipped the phone away, returned to my unassigned seat, and let the rest of the evening play out like a show I had already outgrown. The slideshow opened with that nervous click old remotes make and a jittery dissolve that tried too hard to feel modern. Brandon planted himself beside the screen with the calm of a man who expects his story to arrive pre-approved. Photos paraded past in tidy sequence, cap and gown from college. a handshake with an executive I did not recognize, glossy shots from off-sites where the shirts were crisp and the smiles rehearsed, a pose beside a window that pretended to be a corner office. Soft music swelled as if we were watching an advertisement for inevitability. I let it wash over me until the 9th slide, a group picture from his very first startup pitch, the night I quietly kept the lights on. An early angel check had gone out from my personal company, deliberately routed without fanfare so the help would not become a headline. I knew exactly where I had stood that night, palm on the whiteboard, half turned toward the camera. In the version now glowing on the dining room wall, I had been edited into absence. A sliver of sleeve remained. The faint arc of a watch I no longer own held its place like a watermark, proof that the erasure was not accident but habit. Claudia lifted her glass and announced gratitude for Nadia, whose planning, food, wine, and decorations had made the celebration possible. Compliments fluttered, heads nodded the way metronomes do. Nadia kept her eyes on the rim of her glass and did not correct the record. Weeks earlier, when Claudia said money was tight thanks to Brandon's new car and the catering deposit, she suggested we keep the transaction discreet so Martin would not feel undermined. I wired the few thousand through Nadia's account because that is what families ask when they want help without evidence. I raised my own glass and said to Nadia, and the room echoed me without hearing the meaning. Brandon, who loves height, stood again for a second toast. Ideas are nice, he declared, but success belongs to the person who shows up to sign. Laughter arrived on cue, small and eager. I took a slow sip. It was not the first time I had watched a truth thrive by leaving the woman who funded it off stage. When the lights came up and the last polite applause faded, I slipped into the kitchen and found a stack of linen napkins beside the phone. One still felt new under my fingers. I smoothed it flat and wrote 2 words across the center: military review, then folded the cloth and slid it into my bag like a reminder. You leave for the version of yourself who wakes earlier than dawn. Back at the sink, I stacked plates because overlooked people learn to move like stagehands. No one asked me to help. No one noticed that I did. The faucet hissed. A fork flashed silver. And my mind walked backward through winters until it reached the one from 8 years ago when I mailed Martin a prototype I had designed while embedded with the Advanced Research Corps. It was a compact navigation module, all tight tolerances and quiet redundancies, the kind of tool that would later become standard for secure vehicle communication across multiple divisions. I sent polished blueprints in a neat envelope and tucked in a note in my most careful hand. Thought you might enjoy testing this. He never replied. When I called a week later to check, Claudia told me he was busy and, almost kindly, suggested I consider work that felt more grounded. All this tech talk, she said, goes over people's heads. That night in the living room, trimmed laughter carried over the carpet while Brandon bragged about a client dinner or a launch he had probably practiced in the mirror. I leaned by the fireplace and pretended to read a message. Mr. Calloway, an old family friend, patted Martin on the shoulder and said he still kept that design piece on his desk, the clever box that always drew attention. Martin gave the kind of modest chuckle men practice when they want credit to look accidental. I followed Calloway's gesture to a polished wooden case with a metal edge and a tiny embedded microcircuit sitting beside the hearth. It was not decor. It was my prototype, refitted and rewrapped as a novelty, given away without the bother of attribution. I stepped closer and looked at it the way a stranger would. Calloway said it seemed like something out of a defense lab. Martin met my eyes for a very brief second, the flash of recognition that says, "I know you know," then looked away. Outside, the air was cold enough to make breath visible. The yard I used to mow every Saturday seemed strangely small, as places do when you finally outgrow the permission they require. Through the window, light from the dining room turned the grass into rectangles. I asked myself the question I already knew the answer to. Did they forget what I built? Or did forgetting simply cost less than revising the myth? Upstairs, I opened my briefcase and laid out the documents for the next morning. North Star Dynamics would be hosting a defense review whose core depended on a security layer I helped design. My name did not appear anywhere the public could see, but the code carried my fingerprints unaltered, uncredited, traceable. I do not need applause. I need the right table, the one where my signature lives at the margin that matters. I returned the papers to their sleeves and clicked the latches shut. From the interior pocket, I drew a thin envelope holding the original patent registration. Still valid, still mine. I set an early alarm, 5:45 in the morning, and placed the envelope on top of the case as if it were a keystone. In the dark, I said it aloud, not as a threat, but as a plan. If they insist on forgetting me, I will make forgetting impossible. Dawn scraped a pale line along the glass skin of North Star Dynamics as I turned into the lot and eased into the space labeled for the military liaison, a sign posted not for ceremony but for clarity. I stepped out in full uniform polished brass. Regulation seams, boots that know how to claim ground, and the cool morning air felt like a sober agreement between what I carried and what the day would require. 2 employees slowed when they saw the insignia and blinked their eyes back to neutral. At the doors, the security officer, young and starched to attention, straightened as if a thread had pulled him upright. "Good morning, Colonel Ashford," he said, one hand to his earpiece, the other already opening the way. "She is here," I answered with a single nod and crossed the lobby where coffee steamed, elevators chimed, and ambition tried to pretend it was not nervous. Near the reception desk, Martin and Brandon stood in matching Navy confidence, talking in low tones about the military representative they expected to manage. They did not expect me. The elevator doors parted and the lobby thinned to a hush that did not quite know its own name. Brandon's gaze hit my rank before it reached my face. Martin looked twice, mouth opening, closing, then settling into the hard line he wears when the world refuses his version. "What are you doing here dressed like that?" he asked, half accusation, half embarrassment. "I checked the time because precision is how you cut through theater." "Your review begins in 20 minutes, I said. "You should get ready." I did not wait for a reply. The carpet in the executive corridor took the sound out of my steps. This is a Mercy Building's offer people who come to do work. Outside the war room, the chief of staff met me with the clean efficiency of a person who measures days by outcomes. "Colonel, your place is set. Nameplates are in position." Inside, the room performed minimalism, with expensive confidence, high glass, long table, light that forgave no dust. At the forward corner, my placard waited without flourish. "Colonel Kira Ashford, Key Liaison, Bureau of National Security." I set my briefcase down and skimmed the deck on the main screen. The secure communications overlay the architecture I had shaped and hardened, sat on the 5th slide, sandwiched between 2 innocuous process charts as if ordinariness could hide a backbone. A soft buzz trembled through my secure tablet. The internal security team had sent a quiet note. "Unusual credentials used last night on the headquarters network. File access titled Internal Military Contract Review, version 2. I logged the alert for a full audit, added a line to my mental ledger, and did not lift my eyes to find Brandon. There is no value in a hallway confrontation when the documentation will do your speaking at the table. People arrived in informed clusters. Senior engineers with pens already uncapped, project leads rehearsing composure, contractors who wore their laptops like shields. A manager offered coffee. I declined so both hands could be free. Martin came in and selected a chair that let him look toward me without landing on my eyes. Brandon followed, pretending the seating chart made sense to him, staring a beat too long at the front quadrant where my card Saturday. The room cooled by a fraction when Elena Park entered through the side door, collected and deliberate. She gave me a small nod that meant exactly what it meant, then turned the room to order with a sentence. Chairs settled, screens woke, and in the quiet just before the agenda began, Martin leaned in, voice low and stiff, trying to occupy the space where authority used to obey him. "So," he said, "are you here to observe?" I let the beat run long enough to matter. "No," I said, opening my folder with the simple gravity of a key turning. "I am here to approve." The words removed a door only I had the right to close, and the room adjusted to the new floor without protest. I had barely cleared the prep room threshold when Claudia glided toward me, wearing that cultivated warmth she saves for moments that need dressing. Her heels stitched a polite rhythm across the polished floor. She glanced over one shoulder as if generosity required secrecy, and pressed a slim white envelope into my palm. "Sweetheart," she murmured, "I just do not want you to feel left out today. Treat yourself, maybe a coffee, a new blouse, something nice, and perhaps sit farther back so Brandon can stay focused." She smiled as though she had solved a problem and drifted away before my reply could form. I did not open the envelope immediately. It rode in my hand through 2 quiet corridors, light as a feather and just as suspicious. Only when the hallway emptied did I slide a finger under the flap. Inside lay a tidy receipt. Petty cash withdrawn from the department fund, $100, annotated guest discretionary. It was not kindness, it was camouflage. I refolded the paper and filed the envelope in my inner pocket. not as a keepsake, but as evidence to join the security flag already logged for Brandon's late-night credentials. Back in the war room, I took my seat in the forward section beneath the placard for the Bureau of National Security, exactly where Claudia had suggested I should not be. Brandon, posted at the far end, shuffled notes on his company tablet with the bravado of a magician warming up a crowd. "What is in the folder, Kira?" he called, just loud enough for junior staff to be recruited as audience. "More Army trivia? Are we getting a pop quiz?" I let the question expire on its own. I opened the folder, turned a single page, and placed a document face up on the table. The Citadel Complex crest caught the fluorescent light and returned it with a quiet authority that needed no narration. Laughter dried like spilled water meeting heat. No one asked what the page contained, because some seals answer before the words do. During the break, the room dissolved into clumps of conversation. At the espresso station, Martin stood with his back to me, rotating a cup as if gravity might yield an argument. I stepped beside him and let the hum of the machine fold around our silence. "One more stunt like that," I said, voice even, "and it will not be a family matter. It will be federal." The weather shifted across his face. "You would not do that to your own father," he said, leaning on the word as if it could still carry him. "I would not do that to any father," I answered. "But I will act against a man who misuses public funds and compromises a defense review. I am authorized." His reply collapsed into quiet. Some futures do not slam, they fail to arrive. I returned to the prep room and let the door settle on its hinge. My hands were steady in the way practice teaches. My pulse translated from heat into accuracy. Anger accelerates. Discipline lands. I checked my watch 11:57 and buttoned the top of my jacket. The compliance packet slid into a labeled folder with the satisfying finality of a tool returning to its exact slot. I walked the chain in my head. The audit record for Brandon's credentials, the envelope with Claudia's receipt and the time it changed hands, the chain of custody notes for the Vega modules, the authorization letter stamped with the Citadel crest. Every piece had a place. Every place had a sequence. After enough years, you learn that order is not tidiness. Order is force arranged to move in the right direction. When I stepped back into the conference room, eyes drifted toward me and then pretended they had always been there. The projector hummed like a small engine behind glass. A neutral placeholder glowed on the screen, waiting for someone to invent a version of reality it could display. I sat at the forward quadrant, folded my hands, and let the quiet deepen until it became structural. If they needed a lesson, it would arrive as procedure, not performance. The agenda ticked closer, and the room, perhaps without noticing, began to calibrate itself to the authority already seated at the table. The main session gathered itself like weather. A junior coordinator had placed a secondary placard at my seat in the center row guest of Martin Hale as if proximity could be mistaken for status. Elena Park entered through the side door with the kind of stillness that moves a room. Her eyes found the card, then me. Without commentary, she lifted the placard, split it cleanly, and wrote a new one with a pen that sounded like a small verdict. "Colonel Kira Ashford, key partner." She said it before me and turned to the room. "Let us begin," she said, and then directly and publicly. "Good morning, ma'am. We are honored to have you here." The incidental noises, the whisper of jackets, the carbonated hiss of the HVAC dropped away as naturally as a held breath. I opened my notes and, without performing importance, walked the table through the integration scope for the secure communications layer already exercised with 3 federal partners. I flagged the timelines that would not hold, the underfunded sublayers that would fracture under stress, and a governance adjustment that kept decisions in the hands of teams nearest to risk. It took fewer than 5 minutes because clarity is not a speech, it is a map. I finished with a reminder so plain it did not need italics. Clearance levels must match actual roles. Mislabeling is not clerical, it is operational hazard. After a short break, the projector resumed its low hum and the docket clicked forward. Systems Protocol Overview, presented by Brandon Hale, Senior Technical Lead. Brandon squared himself to the room with the ease of a man who expects the air to hold him up. The opening slide introduced an architecture that liked arrows. The second slide revealed the secure interface nested inside that architecture, now clad in corporate fonts. I lifted my hand not to interrupt, but to anchor fact. That diagram, I said evenly, was authored under IDN ARC Unit 43 and transmitted through an encrypted channel to the Bureau of National Security 11 months ago. Hash and timestamp confirm origin. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was impact aligning with gravity. The little red laser dot made one last nervous circle and died at the edge of the screen. I stood, opened my folder for the first time that session, and handed a printed packet to Victor Lang, the Chief Operating Officer. Original source metadata, notarized by the Federal Registrar, chain of custody intact. I placed a second document on top, printed on heavy cream, the Vega contract, showing my role in explicit language, initial strategic investor and security consultant. That signature had lived in their system nearly 2 years, quiet but indelible. Brandon took one step back as if a door might open behind him. Martin cleared his throat and reached for the old refuge. There must be some misunderstanding. I did not give him the grace of eye contact. There is not. Victor read in the way some people listen. Completely. Then he looked up. Timestamps align. Digital chain holds. It is hers. The room stayed very still in the mechanical way systems do after a forced restart, choosing which processes to reload. I sat without searching for apologies. What mattered was the record, now corrected in the open. By late afternoon, the building had thinned to decision makers and the few who orbit them. Between the boardroom and the media suite hung a tall panel of brushed steel under a linen cover, too deliberate to be decoration. Elena waited for the final agenda item to conclude, then drew the cover down in one clean motion. Light pooled across the metal. The heading read simply what it meant: National Partnership honors neither trumpet nor whisper. My name was not sequestered near the bottom. It occupied the center with a steadiness I recognized. The photograph Elena's team chose came from a formal ceremony my family had been too busy to attend. Dress uniform, silver insignia bright, posture of someone who has learned which doors open when you knock with the right hand. The caption did its work without poetry, unseen until the moment counted. Thereafter, indispensable. No applause. Something better. Recognition, the kind that corrects a ledger. Public relations took photographs like documentation rather than celebration. Legal would approve the phrasing. The wall did what walls seldom do, it spoke. Elena crossed to me with a glass of water that was not a prop. "Can you address the board tomorrow morning?" she asked, voice calm as a tightened seam. "I would prefer today," I said. She considered, smiled almost, and nodded once. When I stepped back into the corridor, a young intern stood before the new panel with her backpack slung on one shoulder. She looked from the photo to my face and stumbled over the formality she hoped to achieve. "Is that really you?" "It still is," I said, and walked to the elevator without turning around. As the doors closed, the sentence I had been carrying for a long time arranged itself aloud enough for me to hear it. They once called me a freeloader. Today they worked to the standard I wrote. 6 months later, on an ordinary Wednesday, a punctual knock met the smell of tomato bisque and thyme winding through my apartment. I dried my hands and opened the door. Martin stood first with a bottle of wine held awkwardly and a framed magazine clipping under one arm. Claudia hovered behind him with a foil-wrapped dish. Brandon followed, newly shaved and empty-handed, the way contrition forgets logistics. Dinner was careful, then kinder. Brandon complimented the soup twice. Claudia admired how orderly the shelves were. Martin mostly studied the room like a map he had not known existed. Over store-bought lemon tarts, the sentence finally arrived. "We did not know," Claudia said, watching the rim of her teacup as if it might supply a script. "What you had done, what you were doing, how far you had gone." I set down my fork. "You did not ask," I said. "You did not want to know." The quiet that followed had weight and respect inside it, the kind that apologies borrow when they are not yet ready to speak. Martin lifted the frame and turned it so I could see. It was the article tied to the plaque, my photograph, and the caption that had done its job. "This hangs in my office now," he said. "I should have done that with your commissioning photo years ago." I did not cry. I did swallow once, the way you mark a moment so it will not wander. "Thank you." Brandon looked at his hands and then at me. "You were not just ahead," he said. "You were somewhere we could not name." I smiled without softening. "It was never about being ahead," I said. "It was about being." I cleared the plates and set coffee to pour. They stayed another hour, talking about weather and work and a church friend Claudia wanted me to meet. It was small, but it was something. A few days later at the bureau office, a new recruit asked whether being underestimated ever gets easier. "No," I said, "but it gets quieter." Justice does not always announce itself with applause. Sometimes it arrives as a clean line in the ledger, as peace where shame used to echo, as silence you do not mistake for surrender. I used to think my family's acknowledgement would validate the life I had built, What I know now is simpler and heavier. Respect feels different when it is not something you chase, but something you carry. If you have ever been edited out of your own story, whether your battlefield was a boardroom, a ward, or a kitchen table, believe the evidence you keep producing. You do not need their permission to matter. You never did. In the quiet that followed their visit, life did not swell into triumph. It settled into alignment. At the bureau office the following week, compliance closed the loop on the alerts I had logged. The overnight access traced to Brandon Hale earned a formal reprimand and the kind of remedial training that replaces swagger with procedure. His credentials were pared back to match his actual remit, and the presentation roster was rewritten so that names stood where work did. Claudia returned the petty cash in full, signed the acknowledgement with a steady hand, and left a brief note that said only what the ledger required. Martin sent no apology, which was almost a relief. Instead, a one-line message arrived without adornment. The review was strengthened by your oversight. Some sentences know not to ask for more than the truth they carry. Work became the language that steadied the room. I briefed a cross-team group on the redundancies inside the secure communications layer, showing how a system learns to fail without breaking and to restart without forgetting. I watched young engineers lean forward in the way curiosity pulls a person past their job title. Afterward, a new analyst lingered at the door to ask the question rookies ask when they look at a wall of closed doors and wonder whether they will ever be invited through. Does it get easier to be underestimated? No, I told her, but it gets quieter. You spend less energy proving and more energy building. Silence stops sounding like exile and starts sounding like focus. On the way out, I passed the brushed steel panel outside the boardroom. It had already gathered the soft scuffs that real things collect, the patina of being noticed. A visitor slowed to read the caption and then stepped back to take in the whole. He did not know I was the person in the photograph, and I did not feel the old urge to announce it. There are rooms where you must be recognized to be effective, and there are rooms where the work recognizes you first. That distinction had taken me years to learn. Now it felt as natural as breathing through your nose to steady a pulse. At home that evening, the light in my kitchen crossed the counter in a long bar, patient as a metronome. I cooked on autopilot and let my mind inventory the day. The corrected roster, the returned funds, the small knot of people who stayed after a briefing with questions that were not about being seen but about being precise. The phone buzzed once with a message from Elena Park, a retainer proposal written in the clear, spare style of someone who does not confuse friendship with governance. I read it twice and drafted a response that kept the boundary where I needed it. I will advise when the work and the ethics align. I will not wear a role to make anyone comfortable. She replied with a single word, understood, and that was enough. Later, when the apartment had cooled and the windows held the city like a quiet aquarium, I pulled out the thin envelope that carried my patent registration and slid it back into the file where it belongs. A small habit perhaps, but one that reminds me that paper is a promise we keep to our future selves. I thought of Nadia and the way her eyes had dipped at the party when credit drifted past her name. I thought of the intern at the plaque, holding herself straighter as recognition rearranged the air. I thought of the many women and a good number of men who have learned to let evidence do their talking. Respect feels different when you are not chasing it down a hallway but carrying it into a room. Before sleep, I stood by the window and rehearsed the sentence I want to hand to anyone who has been edited out of their own story. You do not need permission to matter. You need your proof, your practice, and your patience. The rest arrives at its own pace. A corrected agenda, a returned receipt, a nameplate rewritten with a steadier hand. Families may take the longest to read the new draft. That is all right. Some audiences require more than one performance before they accept the play was never about them. I turned out the light, and the apartment answered with the kind of quiet that is not empty at all. It is the sound of work completed, and of a life calibrated to its true weight.